I am Warren G. Harding III, grandnephew of President Warren Harding. I am a retired orthopedic surgeon, and sometimes I still use the title doctor, but most of the time just me.
Well, thank you. We have a few questions, so we'll just go into it. You were just in a panel, and it was about budgeting, and there were lots of interesting questions there. What first, I guess, your connection with President Harding is quite obvious, and there's sort of an easy way to go from Harding to Coolidge. But when did you first, I guess, how old were you when you first kind of realized how unique your position was, your relationship was?
I grew up in Worthington, Ohio, which is about 40 miles away from Marion, where President Harding lived. I sort of had an idea of the special name. It was a little bit more complicated because my uncle, my father's brother, was also Warren Harding. He was the second. He had been born on President Harding's birthday in 1906. So I knew there was something special, but my family really has been involved with medicine more than politics. So that was really my focus. President Harding's father, George Harding, was a country doctor, and his son, George Harding, also was a psychiatrist in Columbus. My father was a psychiatrist in Columbus, and then I came along. So that was more of a focus in a lot of ways. But I do remember incidents of people commenting on my name. It was close enough to the time when President Harding was in office that people knew who he was a lot more than now.
Right.
Although I think conferences like this are producing much more awareness of how important Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover were.
So maybe to build on that answer, in what ways do you think those 1920s presidents were, Harding and Coolidge? What are some important legacies they've left us?
Well, I think the concept of good economic policy is one part of it. Of course, they cut taxes, they cut the deficit, they cut what we owed after the war years where things went out of control. So that was very important to bring the economy back around. And they also did things that had a dual nature, like the Washington Conference of 1922, it's frequently called the Naval Conference or Disarmament Conference. But it was important because, number one, the weapons of mass destruction of the era, the battleship, were limited. And number two, by limiting the building of a lot of battleships, it helped balance the budget, for not only for America, but for other countries as well.
So sort of the budgetary restraint and just idea of how can we grow this economy, maybe?
Well, I think the idea that they had was that they wanted people in the United States to be prosperous and be able to live a good life. And in order to do that, they had to get taxes down. In order to get taxes down, they had to make government more efficient. And so that it was sort of a snowball effect that they figured that out, and I think it was certainly the right way to do it.
I like that way of approaching it. How did they make the American prosperous rather than just America as a country, as an idea?
Yeah, it was all about the people.
Right.
And the third part of that was that President Harding especially was very interested in making America the example for the rest of the world. He didn't believe in ruling them or forcing them, and he didn't want them to have to be a democracy necessarily, but he wanted them to be able to see us for what we were, as being successful and strong and righteous people.
So sort of a leadership by example.
Yes.
In a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that, especially maybe to connect it back to Coolidge as well, leadership by example is something that he was very much a fan of.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
President Harding was very fortunate to have President Coolidge as his successor, because they believed very much the same. They were very different people in a lot of ways, but they believed in good government, and what they believed as good government was very similar. So
Right.
it was able to be an 8-year run, rather than having to reinvent the wheel after the death of President Harding.
Right. And Harding's unique move to allow Coolidge to sit in on all the cabinet meetings, the first vice president to do that, I think that's much to Harding's credit to
Yes.
bring him in. Very important there. What were some of the themes that you thought might be important to mention in the panel, but that you didn't have enough time to get to?
Well, I just briefly touched on President Harding's appointment of Charles Gates Dawes as the budget director. That was probably, at the first, more important than having Andrew Mellon as the Treasury Secretary. Dawes was a very skilled person who knew how to get things done. He was a general in the Army. He helped the European countries after the First World War get back on their feet, and for that he was given the Nobel Peace Prize in 1928. But he was a good friend of President Harding's. They had known each other. They were both had Ohio roots, and they knew each other. And so President Harding talked him into leaving his job of running a big bank in Chicago, and he came, and for a little over a year, he was the budget director. He did so well that President Coolidge chose him to be his running mate in the election of 1924.
So a slight pay cut there, but much to the benefit of the country. Absolutely.
Yes.
So we've spent a lot of time at this conference talking about Coolidge's legacy, and maybe more broadly the 1920s legacy of Harding, who is also often overlooked. As you mentioned, they shared a lot in common, so that whole idea and set of principles is overlooked. What do you think the most important theme is, or principle, that younger generations, such as myself, really need to embody and take to heart moving forward?
Well, I think the first step is studying what went on back then, and learning about what seemed to work and what didn't seem to work. And that's a starting point. With that information, then you can make good judgment calls on things. And if you really think about it, the similarities between the end of the Wilson administration and the end of the Hoover administration, there are so many parallels between then and now that it kind of gets scary. You know, the flu epidemic, there was a depression in the 20s or early 1920. People call it a recession, but if you look at it real carefully, some people would call it a depression.
Right, it was quite deep.
And what President Harding did was let things solve themselves. He didn't try to start throwing money at it, or and it worked out. There's a very good article by James Grant, who writes the Grant newsletter, and he points that out very carefully. But just the general principles of good government, take care of people, and the other thing that I think about was that both Harding and Coolidge used the idea of putting less government in business and more business in government, which kind of makes sense.